morning, everyone. Nice to see some of you today. We're continuing our theme of for the year's Dharma talks set by Master Jeever, which is self-dedication to Dharma, to practice, and to service. And because it's a rather broad topic, we choose smaller subtopics that relate to it each week. So the one that I've decided on is the Dharma Seals, or the marks of existence. And what does Dharma Seal mean, you might ask? What's Dharma and what kind of seal? Well, if you're a little bit new to these teachings, Dharma can be spelled with a big D or a little d. If it's a big D, it refers to Buddha Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, or the true nature of reality. With a small d, it refers to stuff, phenomena, things. Everything's a dharma, the flowers are dharmas, I'm a dharma, the trees are dharmas, this meditation hall is a dharma. And what kind of seal do we mean? It's not the mammal with flippers that lives by the ocean, but rather, I wonder if anybody else here is old enough to remember the Good Housekeeping Seal of Approval. A magazine that was popular during the 50s with homemakers, and they would give their seal of approval to different products, and that meant that you could trust that product. So it's a seal, approval. It's a little bit closer to what we mean by a Dharma seal, I suppose. It means that with regard to the big D Dharma, that any teaching that takes into account these characteristics of existence, these marks, is consistent with the Buddha's teaching. And then with regard to the little d dharmas, it describes everything that exists. So in that sense, they are marks of existence. So how many Dharma seals are there? There are 3 or 4, depending on how you count. They have names in the Pali language, which is the language that Buddha's teachings were preserved in, closest to the language that he probably used when he was alive. Anicca is the first one, which means impermanence. Dukkha, which means unsatisfactoriness or suffering. And anatta, which means no self. And Thich Nhat Hanh, interestingly, uses impermanence, no self, and nirvana, which is, when we count them as 4, the 4th Dharma seal. So I wanted to talk about this topic because it's such a basic, foundational teaching of the Buddha. And in fact, only by understanding the Dharma seals can we be in a position to recognize the truth of any philosophy or teaching, and more importantly, to see the true nature of reality. So I'll talk about each of these seals. The first one, the first Dharma seal, as I said, is anicca, or impermanence. It means that all compounded things, all phenomena, are impermanent. And this is pretty easy to grasp for anyone who gives it a moment's thought. What in our life ever stays the same? What can we count on to last without change? The weather, and as we know now, even the climate is changing. Our bodies constantly change, certainly. All beings, including ourselves, we know will die one day. We just don't know when. Our most prized and treasured possessions must be protected, insured, locked away, handled with kid gloves, and yet they break, or are lost, or stolen. Our friends can change, move away, and die. Likewise, our family members. Even things which are very old and seem never to change, like mountains. They're also undergoing change. Very slow-moving glaciers carve away at the land. The high places are ground down by wind and the erosion of rain. It may take a long time, but change is still operating. Even in the cosmos, the sun will one day burn itself out. We know that stars throughout the universe come into being and eventually go out of existence. So the astronomers tell us. Our mundane, day-to-day existence is time-bound, and the nature of time is change. We can't really pin down the present moment. It can only exist because it's not past and not future. But it has been and will be both of those. We might ask, why are things impermanent? Why is this a mark of all existence? If we look carefully, we can see that this impermanence arises from the fact that phenomena are compounded or composed of other things. Different elements are constantly coming together and then breaking apart. And this is true throughout the universe. Everything in existence at the present moment was once part of the singularity that exploded in the Big Bang. All the elements, the subatomic particles, our bones, the air we breathe, it all comes from that moment when everything was one, apparently. Change and transformation began then, as far as we can tell, and is still ongoing. Everything in the universe is still flying away from that original explosion of one. So of course, impermanence is a fact of life. This fact of impermanence leads to the second Dharma Seal, which is dukkha, or suffering, or unsatisfactoriness. We feel unhappiness and stress because we know we can't keep what we like, nor can we ultimately avoid what we fear. We can't stay young. We can't avoid growing old, getting sick, and dying. This is a fundamental truth recognized by the Buddha at the beginning of his search. Our loved ones will be taken away from us eventually. Similarly, praise will be followed by insult. Getting what I want will be followed by not getting what I want. Success will be followed by failure. Comfort by discomfort. And happily, the cycle reverses as well. But we cling to our preferences, what we like, and we struggle to avoid what we don't like. And this very clinging, if you can simplify by just saying clinging to our likes and dislikes, brings us dissatisfaction and frustration. The Dharma Seals are interwoven, so I'll keep touching on one and then on another and returning to the first and so on. They interconnect in so many ways, so it's impossible to talk about them in a strict order. So I've been talking about how impermanence gives rise to suffering, but we can also see that there's a positive side to impermanence. It makes newness possible. How terrible it would be if everything always stayed the same. Impermanence makes everything possible. This is a teaching from Thich Nhat Hanh. If a seed were not impermanent, it could never germinate and grow into a plant. I don't have to remain in ignorance. I can learn and grow. Children learn, grow, and develop. I might wish sometimes that my infant grandson would stay a small child, and I may experience disappointment when he grows to an age when his grandparents are not such an important part of his life. The fact that all things are compounded and therefore impermanent also means that everything is interconnected, interdependent. Just as at the Big Bang, all things are still part of all other things. So it's useless to talk of impermanence as good or bad. And it's foolishness to wish my young grandson would stay a child. Relationships must embrace the change that's inevitable, or they'll only bring pain. But what is it that urges me to wish for my grandson not to grow up? To cling to things as they are and to resist inevitable changes. It's because I experience myself and my grandson as separate. I cling to an identity, for both of us, an ego that sets me apart from other beings, all other phenomena. I fail to see that my grandson is changing moment to moment, day by day. Instead, I cling to the way he was one day when I felt very close to him, or he smiled at me in a certain way. The correct view, and the third Dharma Seal, is anatta, and not self. Thich Nhat Hanh says that impermanence is looking at reality from the point of view of time, and no self is looking at reality from the point of view of space. There are two sides of reality, and they're corollaries, meaning that one is the manifestation of the other. You can't have one without the other. If a phenomenon is impermanent, then it cannot have an inherent self. And if something exists interdependently without an inherent self, then we know that it's impermanent. Everything about me is impermanent besides the most obvious part, my physical form. Equally, my thoughts, my emotions, my feelings and sensations are all impermanent. But just because all things are impermanent and lack a true inherent self does not mean that they don't really exist or don't matter. To think this would be to make a nihilist error, which is the opposite of the eternalist error, two extreme and incorrect views. The nihilist view would be that things lack an inherent independent self, and therefore have no existence. The eternalist actually ascribes something like an eternal soul, a very unique, unchanging, inherent identity to beings and phenomenon, that they are therefore ultimately real. Both of those are extreme and incorrect views. Beings and things do exist, but not in the way we usually assume them to exist, our conception of them. As I mentioned earlier, all things exist interdependently. In Thich Nhat Hanh's words, they inter-are. In Buddhism, we call this fact emptiness. Things are empty because they are impermanent and do not exist separately or independently. Everything exists in a way that transcends the labels of being and not being. Instead of Hamlet's question, to be or not to be, we can say with confidence, to be and not to be. Emptiness transcends all concepts, meaning anything we can say with words. That is why sutras such as the Heart Sutra and the Diamond Sutra, part of which we'll chant in a few minutes, can sound so confusing and contradictory, because they're trying to express emptiness in words. In order to touch the deepest realization of impermanence and no self, it's usually necessary to practice meditation. Because only in that stillness and concentration are we able to break through into the actual experience of these Dharma Seals, or marks of existence. When we do that, when we touch deeply the nature of impermanence, of no self and interbeing, in the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, we touch the ultimate dimension, the nature of nirvana. Nirvana is the fourth Dharma Seal, described as the state beyond extremes. We can think of it as the truth of reality, even transcending ideas of impermanence and non-self. Because if we get caught up in ideas of impermanence and non-self, then we'll be clinging to a concept, and nirvana will escape us. Similarly, we can't grasp after nirvana as a goal, because it's ungraspable. By grasping, we are guaranteed not to experience nirvana. For me to realize nirvana, I must drop all grasping and clinging. Only then will I realize the truth, which it is. The fears and neuroses that keep us in what we call samsara, the state of deluded clinging which keeps us in a cycle of birth and death. These fears and neuroses depend on dualistic categories, oppositions like birth and death, increasing and decreasing, being and non-being, rich and poor, healthy and sick, and so on. With categories like these, we are naturally drawn to select one, vote for one of them, and reject the other. This selecting and rejecting is grasping and clinging and keeps us in samsara. If instead we can see that these oppositions are actually just complementary notions, relativities that depend on each other for existence, we see that these opposites are empty, just like everything else. They're just relative ideas or concepts. We don't have to be enslaved by them. Samsara becomes nirvana when we free ourselves from our clinging to our preferences, clinging to our likes, to what we think is good. And even the terms samsara and nirvana are opposites, aren't they? Which means we also have to drop our concept of one being better. We can only think of samsara because we have the concept nirvana, and vice versa. Neither one can be grasped as inherently or ultimately real. The Buddha said that his teachings are like a finger pointing to the moon. We shouldn't confuse the finger with the moon. It's because of the finger that you can see the moon. With this, he was expressing the fact that his teachings are skillful means to help us realize for ourselves the truth of our own nature and of all reality. The teachings are not meant as absolute truths that we kill or die for. It's important to understand that each of the Dharma Seals needs to be seen in light of each other one. I talked about how impermanence and non-self are different ways of viewing reality. Impermanence in terms of time, non-self in terms of space. We also have to see nirvana in impermanence and in non-self. This will keep us from putting nirvana in its own category, in opposition to the other two, or three if you include dukkha. Impermanence contains within itself the nature of nirvana. This means we can transcend the duality of permanence versus impermanence toward an understanding that's free of that opposition. We don't have to experience suffering and fear at ideas of impermanence. The same goes for self versus non-self. If we can see non-self as containing the nature of nirvana, we can be free from the fear and suffering of the concept of non-self. Just thinking about these ideas will probably not get us very far. It's much more effective to put them into practice in meditation. Because what happens when we meditate? We take an object, such as the breath, and by placing our attention on it, we still the mind and develop concentration. We see the impermanence of our minds and thoughts, and of our pleasant and unpleasant feelings. This impresses on us the truth of impermanence and also of non-self. Where is the I, who is in charge of this constantly changing kaleidoscope of physical and mental activity? Gradually we begin to sense the freedom in loosening our grasp on the false sense of self that we've held so dear. We begin to experience heightened compassion for others, as well as for myself, which has now taken on its true proportions, not the funhouse mirror version that my ego creates, bigger in some places, shrunken in others, but distorted all over. That's the end of my little talk on the Dharma Seals. Thank you for your attention and for being part of whatever benefit might arise from this talk. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings enjoy happiness. May all beings be liberated.